GCC really was Atari's new development arm for this new non-Nolan Atari, the one they gave freedom to.
The guys feel like GCC had the autonomy to go and kind of do amazing things, and they did. Right? They kind of became the new heart of what Atari did.
In the glow of the cathode ray, every game we play on our 2600 into the vertical plane, our highest scores have been ranked. Into the vertical plane, generation Atari.
Hey, Steve.
Hey, Jeff, how's it going?
It's going good. It's middle of the summer. Well, it's ending the summer pretty soon, and we're finally getting a podcast out.
Well, I spent the last 6 weeks playing Diablo 4 and kind of wasted all my time. I didn't even get to my third lesson, Atari 700, but I'm editing it now, so it's getting close.
I worked the last 6 weeks on getting laid off and looking for a new job, which I've found pretty much, and working on something else, like some collectibles things.
That's cool.
Anyway,
I was excited because when I was working on the 700 lessons, I was thinking about my next lesson is about title screens, which sounds kind of weird, but the Atari 700 had such amazing title screens for their games. And also it was kind of the first system that had real title screens for all the games from that golden age era. Anyway, it's in the whole overview of that is in the lesson. Well, one of the things I wanted to do was get an interview with someone from GCC, the guys who developed the 7800, about the amazing title screens they did for their VCS games and for the 7800. Didn't really get that in this interview. It's more like an overview of Michael Feinstein, who worked at GCC from 1982 to 1985. And he worked on some amazing games for the VCS and one for the 7800, which is behind me, Desert Falcon. And
That's a good game.
The interview did a couple things. It was, first of all, great interview because seemingly everyone from GCC is just some sort of amazing guy, amazing person. Not just a guy. I'm sure there are women there too. But my point is some sort of amazing person that has gone from GCC to do amazing things afterwards. But also did know that he worked on Phoenix, Joust, Jungle Hunt, and Battlezone for the 2600, as well as Desert Falcon for the 7800. And he had very interesting things to say. So I think it'd be really cool if we went into that interview now, and then let's come back and talk about it.
Sounds great. Let's do that right now.
I have a secret love for GCC, like all the stuff that you guys did back then, because it's such an interesting
company. It was
company.
A crazy place to be, I'll tell you that. It was my first job out of college.
Michael Feinstein from GCC, and you, I'm just going to start out. So you programmed or were a co-programmer of 2600 Phoenix, Jungle Hunt, Battlezone, Joust, and 7800 Desert Falcon from the years 1982 to 1985. And I mean, this is fascinating. I don't think your name is officially associated with any of those titles in Atari places, but on it was on a couple other places that I saw. So.
Yeah, it definitely is on there. It depends where you look. I mean, I don't know who updates these, and I put no effort into making it accurate. But I have many witnesses who can attest. I absolutely worked on those games.
Yeah, no, I believe you. I think that's not about not believing you. I think there is a gap of, and maybe we'll get to it a little later. Like it's seemingly Atari Inc. and GCC. There's a huge separation there, and I think a lot of the lore about what you guys did hasn't really been told, especially since some of the stuff is most of it is absolutely amazing, right? Like it's like stuff that you did. So that's what I kind of wanted to get into. So let's start.
Sure.
So Michael Feinstein, how did you start working at GCC?
Yeah, so I was at MIT, and I was graduating in 1982 with a computer science degree, and I was interviewing for jobs. I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I actually interviewed at many companies. it's actually a little bit of a coincidence that I ended up at GCC. I did interview with them on campus with many other companies, and I never heard from them, and that's okay. I, was actually about to accept a job in California, working at a very different place. And I got a call from Kevin Curran, who was the CEO of GCC, one of the founders. Kevin said, "Oh, I found your resume. We actually really wanted to follow up with you, but kind of got lost. So would you come in for an interview?" And I said, "Well, I'm about to accept a job with this company in California. If you want me to interview, it's going to have to be fast." He goes, "How about this afternoon?" And I just like zipped over there and I interviewed, and it went really well. And, I was excited about the opportunity to work on video games. I was not a huge video game player, but it was, this was the early 80s. It was very kind of cutting edge. And so they offered me the job, and I decided to take it, which obviously led to all the games and stuff that we're going to talk about. But also, on a different angle, I met my wife working there.
Oh, how
So
cool.
if
What
I
was her
didn't take
job?
that job, well, she came in later after we stopped doing video games. I stayed at the company for a while when we made Macintosh peripherals, which is like a whole second part of the company's life. And she worked then in like a, data entry role, junior level position. But, I've been married to her since, for a long time, 34 years. So it's really good that I took that job at GCC.
That's
So
awesome.
yeah, so it was really just kind of I didn't really have like a strong passion like I've got to work on video games, but it just obviously seemed like a lot of fun, and I loved what they were doing, and it just felt great. It was a bunch of really young people, and just felt exciting, and so I went for it, and I just dove in right away. I started working right after school, and then I did take a little bit of time off once I started just to go on a trip, since I had just graduated. But then I came back, and that summer we worked on 2600 Phoenix with John Morasic was my partner on that game. And this was they were just getting going. You probably know some of the history of GCC. If you talk to Steve Golson or others,
Yeah.
they know it better than I do from those early days. But this was in the first wave of 2600 games that we did, and they hired a bunch of people. Some were more experienced, some were people like me. John Morasic was actually 1 year behind me at MIT. This was his summer job. There was another guy who worked on Vanguard who was like right out of school. There were a lot of us, either very early in our careers for the most part. And we were just figuring all this out. Like by the time I showed up, they'd been working on it for a few weeks already, working on the infrastructure. So they knew like, okay, we knew how to build a game. We know how to get it going. We had the basic shell of like how to do a game, like just how to make it work, even just to make it go into a cartridge and run. But we didn't have anything else. Like we didn't get much help from Atari, right? So we were licensing these games to Atari, as you probably know. And it was Atari who their strategy was to secure the rights to popular arcade games. So Phoenix, for example, was an arcade game. And, then to do a home version of those games.
Right.
And so they had those licensing rights, and they contracted with us to do those games. Sometimes we were doing it. Sometimes we were in competition with an internal team at Atari to see who could get it done better and faster. But, the thing that was interesting is, I went to MIT at a formal degree in computer science. You learn all this structured programming, the right way to do things, maintainable code and all this. And then you get to this job and, the system is so hardware limited. We can talk about that during this session, but you basically have to break every rule in order to get good performance out of it. If you look at those very early 2600 games, they look very basic. The gameplay was very basic. They just, they didn't feel like an arcade type game. And that's because they were not pushing the limits. And I think our strategy from the beginning was we're going to push all the limits to try to get this as close as we can to feel like an arcade game, given the very limited, hardware capabilities of the system. And we're going to crank them out fast and get these projects done in a few months.
So let me ask you a little bit about that, because it's fascinating to me. First of all, that what you mentioned, MIT, I think it's funny. Steve Golson was from those guys, and Kevin Curran, they were from Harvard, right?
No, they all went to MIT.
Oh, they all went to MIT.
They
Okay,
all
so
went to
that was
MIT.
the joke that because I asked him about Harvard. Okay, so it's the opposite.
Yeah, well,
You guys made
all
fun of
make
the guys
fun
from
of
Harvard.
We make fun of Harvard, but no, I mean, I think there were several years in a row where, believe it or not, GCC hired more MIT software engineers than any other company on the planet.
That's amazing. I mean, so that's a question because I think most of the guys at Atari Inc. or a lot of them were like Berkeley. They're like, there's a definite, I feel, a different feel between what they produced and what you guys produced. Does that make sense to you? Does it seemingly? I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but
Yeah, I'm not sure. We never met those guys. Like, really only a handful of people we met from Atari. I mean, Kevin, who did all the business negotiations, and maybe some other people maybe met more. But like in our office here in Cambridge, Mass, like the main guy who came in was like the one guy that was like owned our relationship and maybe some legal people and stuff like that, but no technical people. We didn't collaborate with them at all technically. So we got no development tools from them. We got nothing from them. We had to figure out how everything worked on our own.
so this is what's incredible to me because what you produced was after 1982 and before it was vastly superior in many ways, right? So I feel like this is MIT talking. This is your guys being super smart
maybe,
guys.
Yeah. Although there were other third-party companies at Activision and iMagic, and then later other ones. They were making really good games too, and I think it was more. I mean, and again, I don't know the backgrounds of all the different people, but I really think it's like the willingness to kind of break all the rules of the stuff they taught you in school, and to push. And like we studied those other games. So like when Activision came out with a new game, we didn't study to copy it. We studied it to learn techniques.
Yeah.
Like, how did they do that? Like, we would look at the games very carefully. Oh, how did they make it scroll like that? How did they do that? And we would look at their code. I mean, it was all assembly code, and we would try to figure out, oh, that's cool. They did that. And we just built up this bag of tricks. Again, not to copy their game in any way, but it's like, oh, if you need to do this, you could kind of do it this way and it works. And we just had this bag of tricks of how to make stuff happen, how to get it done. And it's really like when I think about it now in today's world where, the idea of limited resources of computing is kind of hard to, like, no one understands that. Your phone has tons of storage, all the processors are fast, but it was so constrained that you really had to like push and be creative and look for workarounds and shortcuts and all things you could do to kind of get more out of a very limited hardware system. And I think if you didn't do that, there was just no way to make the games look good and play well.
Oh yeah, so I'm not going to dig any much more. So I just want to mention. I was going to ask you a question about the management style of the guys that you see, because I'm just wondering if there is a reason why the guys in Silicon Valley were maybe they weren't having a harder time. I feel like there's some magic you guys had. There's some sprinkle of fairy dust or something that produced something special. That's what I think.
I can't comment about the other folks because I never met them. I think GCC was special. That part I would agree with. So I think a lot of it stems from, if you look at the early history of the company, which I'm not going to recount in detail, but they basically reverse engineered an arcade game and figured out how to hack around it to make it better in order to sell enhancement kits. So that whole idea of we can figure out how it works, we can figure out how to hack it together, again, not following the rules in some ways, but just being innovative and creative and problem solving and willing to work hard to figure out how something works when you don't have the documentation and the information. That's in the DNA of all those founders of the company.
Yeah.
Because that's just what they did. And that is very much like an MIT ethos. Like, I knew many people at MIT who were just fearless about solving a problem because you just figure, if I just push on it hard enough, I'll figure it out.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's
so
cool.
I think that is part of the culture of the school. That part's true. Now, not everyone at GCC went to MIT, certainly. I mean, we did have a lot, but not everyone. But I do think that was what we were looking for, was people that were kind of fearless, in that way, technically, and people who got excited about kind of finding workarounds and shortcuts and ways of doing things that people hadn't thought about before, rather than people who are scared by it, right? And so I think, and then once you start that culture in a company, you start hiring people that are excited about that, that's what you're looking for, and it just keeps going. And we all learn from each other, right? So we had some super smart people, particularly in those early days, but I mean throughout the company, who were like, and we were just sharing information. I figured out how to do this. I figured out how to do that. I saw you did that in that game. How'd you make it work like that? And we just shared information. And so the fact that we were all willing to work with each other and collaborate, it just kind of helped advance our bag of tricks like much faster.
Now, I know when I talked to Steve, he said something like GCC produced like 70 or 80 games through that time for the various platforms for the 2600, 5200, and the 7800, which I want to get to because that's the lessons I'm writing on YouTube about how to do a little bit of programming. So I want to, but I know you don't. I know I'm not going to talk. This won't worry about.
It's in my deep past. I don't remember.
Yeah. It's not about that. I want to just talk to you, but so esoterically, like not necessarily anything technical. It's interesting to me that you guys were so productive and it was so good. I mean, I thought first game I saw up here, you mentioned Vanguard, which I know you didn't work on, but
that was Dave Payne. Yeah.
Do you know if that was one of the first ones that came out?
Yeah, it was, I think, so that was exactly the same time as Phoenix. So Dave started like 2 weeks before me, and so like we were all working at the same time. He's a fantastic guy. He's still at Apple, by the way. He's been working at Apple a long, long time.
That's cool.
So we were all working on these games at about the same time, and I think they all came out for that Christmas. So this is the thing, right? So we started, like some people started in May. I started at the beginning of June, 1982, right? And so
this is right after Atari Pac-Man came out. That was not very well received,
right?
And
we were working on Ms. Pac-Man, which.
So you guys were contracted I believe right after that, when someone lost faith in they were looking to expand the team.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you've talked to Steve about the history of the company, I mean, I mentioned this video game, this arcade game that they had reverse engineered.
Yeah.
They got sued by Atari over that, but they impressed Atari so much during the court case that Atari dropped the suit and said, "Let's do a contract."
Right? That's smart. That's smart.
Which was really smart. I think they just saw like, wow, these are super talented guys. Now it started off as arcade games, and we did do some arcade games for Atari. But then they also asked us about doing games for the 2600 and then the 5200. And of course we said, yes, we could definitely do it. I mean, Kevin was a very sharp businessman, still is a sharp businessman. And, he just said, yes, like, we'll figure it out. I don't think we've ever shared the structure of our deal, but we had a very financially advantageous deal with Atari. Kevin did a phenomenal job. And so, for my first job out of school, I was pretty well compensated. So, I mean, and we got bonuses, we got profit sharing. So we were motivated to like get these games done. And then getting back to that first wave of games. So it's like June of 82. And the idea is we got to get this done. I don't remember the deadline. Let's say it's got to be done by September so we can get this in the stores for Christmas. Let's just say I don't remember the exact date, but it was something in that range.
It's in that range. Yeah, gotcha.
It was definitely in that range. And so it's like, okay, like, I don't even know what I'm doing yet. I got to figure out how this thing works. And we're like just cranking. So, I mean, we worked very long hours. It was a lot of fun. It was a fun environment. We had a room full of video games. We got all the food we could eat. The company paid for everything. It wasn't a problem.
Were you just out of school at this point? You just graduated?
Literally, it was like right out of school, like right after I graduated. I graduated on a Friday, and on Monday I was at work there. So,
how fun! That's very interesting. Yeah. Cool.
But it was a blast, and like I said, great environment. It was a lot of fun. We were working really hard, and we cranked these games out. And but the thing you have to realize about these games is because of the hardware constraints. What we did is we would kind of write something that wouldn't fit into a cartridge, basically too big, too many capabilities, and then we had to like trim it down to something that would just barely fit.
Yeah.
Right, because the cartridges, like, they were generally 8K of ROM, very tiny, and I remember the first Phoenix, like that when we just like wrote everything we wanted to do and it worked, was probably twice that size. And
Oh,
we
wow.
cut out parts of the game and optimized, and we eventually got it to fit into 8K just. So that's all part of the process too. So it's not just like write it from start to finish. It's not like writing a paper, right? Like right from the beginning to the end. They're like you're always trying to figure out what can we do, how do we make it better. And we were playing each other's games throughout. So we had a big lab and just big open space. We've all got our games going, and as we're making progress on the games, we're all walking around and kind of playing each other's games and talking and looking at it and suggesting. So it was just such a great creative environment to try to get the best out of it. And we got the game done on time, and there were commercials on TV by Christmas time. It was very exciting.
That's incredible. I mean, that's I specifically. I know you didn't work on Vanguard, but I had Phoenix soon after. But I got Vanguard that Christmas, and it blew me away. I was only 12 years old at the time, right? So I was like, "This is." And I did not know you guys worked on this stuff until a couple years later.
We were a secret.
You were a magazine. There's a magazine that talked about you guys building the 7800, and then they talked about how you had built some of the 2600 games. It was much later when the realization came that a lot of the magic had actually started to come from come from you guys, right? That some of the very best stuff was coming there because so you remember Miss Pac-Man. You didn't work on it, but you remember that was such a huge upgrade from the Pac-Man. Was that around the office? Did that
we actually built
sense?
The original Pac-Man game.
Oh, yes, the Miss Pac-Man.
The guys at GCC did the original Ms. Pac-Man again as an upgrade, and first, and then they turned it into. It was a similar story with a different company. We contracted with them, and they did the Ms. Pac-Man game, arcade game, and then of course we did the home version for the 2600, and it was just like so much better than Pac-Man. It looked. I mean, really, as close as you could to Ms. Pac-Man, it played well. And I think that was one of the real keys, because you could never make these games look as good as the arcade games if you didn't have the hardware capability. But we wanted it to play as, so it felt reminiscent of playing that arcade game in terms of the gameplay and the feel of the game. And we spent a lot of time on that aspect of these games. So it's not just how it looks, which is, of course, important, but how it plays. Like, we wanted it to be as fun as the arcade game.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuances there that isn't just what it looks like, right? There's the speed of the movement, the fact that the Miss Pac-Man turned, and this is also with the games you worked on too. With Phoenix, for example, which the arcade game was beautiful. It's hard to replicate that, but I just played it the other day just for the fun of it, and it plays so similar to what I remember the arcade game being like. That I think that is I think something that stands out from the stuff you guys did was, I guess, that like understanding that the nuances were important, not just squinting your eyes to see that it might look close, but there's sound and timing and all sorts of things that go into that. That's not just the graphics.
Yeah, and and again, the thing you have to remember is, like, for Phoenix or for any of these games, we didn't have the original source code of the original game. Right. We just had the game in the game room. So we would play it for hours to learn all the nuances, to learn everything about it, and we took careful notes. How did it work? And then also we were trying to mimic the sounds, the graphical look, but like all the aspects of the gameplay, we had to learn it just by playing it. So that was research. And then, again, because we're writing on such a basic system, we're creating the code to try to emulate that, to copy that in some way, to mimic it from scratch, right? And again, to get the nuances of the gameplay right. So again, there's a feel to these games, right? It's like, it's how does it feel when you're playing it? So you really feel like the control is good and it's responding well to the controls and it's doing what you want it to do. And it just takes time to do that level of polish on a game. And we were, we had really high standards. I think that's, even though we were cranking these things out in one sense, we had very high standards for the quality of what we were putting out there. And, I think that just was part of the culture of the company. Like, we all wanted to do something perfect. Although there is a bug in Phoenix that did make it out, and it is still there.
Oh, really? Can you tell us what it is?
I don't remember the details of it, but there's some situation where something happens and you're at the far right edge of the screen, and a missile comes straight down through the middle of you only, and it doesn't kill you.
Oh,
I
interesting.
don't remember exactly all the nuances of the situation, but I remember and these games are burnt into ROMs and they don't get updated.
No.
And so I remember playing it like sometime after it ships, like, what happened? And we actually used to have, QA teams that would, these were young kids that would come, maybe high school age kids or early college age kids, and they're playing these games, and we used VCRs because that was the technology. So we're video recording, playing games all the time, and then they would say, "Oh, something looked weird there." They'd go back and rewind the tape and look. And so I wasn't recording it then, but then I said, "Okay, I have to try to make that happen again." And I did it again with the QA team, and we're recording, and then we saw like, "Oh, what happened?
Oh,
How
wow.
did that happen?" And I went back and looked at the code. It's like, "Oh, I don't remember the details." But it's like, "Oh, there's some little bug."
And you can't fix it, right? Yeah.
And it's still, 40 plus years later, all the emulators that are playing this code, it's still there. I'm sure no one's ever going to find it or fix it. At least it's in the player's favor. I didn't stress out about it as much because at least it's in the player's favor. So I felt like, okay, think of it as like an Easter egg. It's like some little bonus the player gets.
Yeah, it's not killing them off. So
right.
you mentioned that you would write like a 32K game and then try to pare it down. Were you I know I don't want to get technical. I just want to there's a mainframe or a mini computer dev system you were using, and then you were transferring the code to the 2600 as you were writing it?
It was a specialized test. It was like test equipment type system. So I can talk a little bit about it.
That you obviously was built by you guys too, right? This is
not
something
modified, I would say. Okay. Modified, yeah. So there were products that already existed that were used to debug hardware that was built, right? And so this was like a state-of-the-art thing. It was from a company called Genrad. I don't know what happened to the company. But what it would do is it would emulate the microprocessor. So it emulated a 6502.
Amazing.
Speed, right? And then you had a development environment where you could write your assembly code and build it and download it and run it, and then set breakpoints and other things you would do to try to test programs or something's going wrong, and step through the source code step by step and see what's happening. And so that was the system that we used. We did buy an off-the-shelf system. We did I'd say customize it so it met our needs exactly. But the base system to kind of do this, certainly did exist. It was used to debug hardware, and other companies would use things like this too. So, but these were expensive. I don't remember how much they cost. Tens of thousands of dollars back in the early 80s, which was pretty expensive. And we had one on every single person's workstation, right? So we had lots of them. We had lots of them.
So the crazy Atari guy in me is thinking, okay, so do any of those bigger versions exist anywhere? That before they were cut down or anything like that?
I have no idea. Like, we didn't really have like a good source code control system or anything like that. And no, I'm sure we were keeping old versions at the time, but you really couldn't run this in a cartridge. You could only run this in this environment on the test system
all the resources
didn't
don't
have
exist.
The constraints. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, and we knew it was too big, but it's like, well, let's not worry about that. Let's just like write it and see where we are, and then we'll figure out what to do.
That's kind of like writing books, right? Like you write everything, and then the actual creation is in the editing, right?
Exactly.
That's
exactly. And so we had like multiple ways of trying to cut these things down. Sometimes you just cut a whole part of the game. Like maybe there's some aspects like, I just can't do this, like some type of wave in the game or something where we just can't do that. That's out.
Right.
But a lot of what we did was just, I would call it like squeezing. So look for ways to do what you had written in a more optimized way, just to make the code shorter.
So throw out all those good coding practices you learned.
Yeah, all those good coding practices. And we did a lot of that.
Go to.
Yeah, we did. And then look for, I could get pretty esoteric here. We look for all kinds of things where some, because everything was, you could look at everything kind of expressed in, bytes of code. I mean, I found cases where like the graphical design of an element was very close to the same sequence of bytes I needed for a subroutine. So I convinced the graphic designers to change it so it was identical.
That's
and then
amazing.
I used like the way that something was described graphically as a subroutine.
That's incredible. I love that. Right? Like that's awesome.
That was like my crowning achievement. And then that was a trick that was in the bag of tricks. And other people did it other times, and when it was possible. And so, just all kinds of things like that. To just keep squeezing it and optimize it, and then but it made the code was not maintainable, right? Like so, like someone else looking at it saying, "What the heck? Like, why would you do? Like, I don't understand what's going on." And we didn't spend a lot of time commenting the code because we knew it wasn't going to be maintained for the long term. And sometimes my comments would just be, "Trust me."
So you had graphic designers that designs the
we
graphics
did,
for you guys.
and a sound designer as well. Yeah. So we, as you noted, I think you made a brief comment there about Ms. Pac-Man. Like, it turns, like
Yes,
the
it turns.
character turns, right? Which is the Pac-Man did not.
Yes.
And it turns because the arcade game one turns. And so there's animations in that turning, and there's animations in many of the characters we had. And so we actually did build a character development system for our graphic designers to use. I think we had I can think of at least 3 graphic designers, maybe there are more, but definitely 3 graphic designers. And, they would, within the constraints of the hardware, they would design characters and animate them, to look like the arcade versions within the constraints we had, and really played with the colors and the animation. And then they were also part of, hey, we've got to squeeze this down. Can we get rid of one of the stages of the animation? Can you do something different so it takes up less space? And they would collaborate with us on all this stuff. They were all part of the merry gang of pranksters that we were. And we worked with them really collaboratively, and they were geniuses at making this stuff look good. And similarly for sound, we had someone who did our sound design. The sound chip of the Atari 2600 is really very low end, so she was really limited.
Yeah.
to try to. She's like a classical composer, and she's like doing stuff with this sound chip, but she got a lot out of it and did a great job with that too.
She did, because there are some good sounds that come out of that TIA chip, which is can't do much. You're right.
Yeah.
Okay, Jungle Hunt. I want to talk about Jungle Hunt because I remember getting this, and it was the summer of '83 or something. It was amazing, dude. I mean, I can't believe how close it was. Because we did spend a lot of time as kids back then. Like, you kind of wanted the games to be as close to the arcade game as possible, and it was a big deal, right? It's kind of why Pac-Man kind of fell off, because like, it's not really that close to the arcade game.
Yeah.
And first Vanguard, which I know you didn't make, but I was like, wow, that crazy. Then I got Miss Pac-Man, and then Jungle Hunt was like, oh, this is almost exactly like it. And I wondered, I mean, I think only a couple things are missing. Like, I think there's a slope where the barrels go down that may not be there.
We couldn't do the slope. We did have the rocks bouncing and the guy jumping over them, but the slope, it just wouldn't. I mean, it would have been very hard to make a convincing looking slope. If you look at almost all the Atari 2600 games, everything's kind of horizontal.
Yeah.
Right, and that's because of the nature of the graphics chip. It just was conducive to doing horizontal. There's no kind of smooth looking diagonals anywhere, because the graphics chip just wouldn't do it. It would be super chunky, and then it would look bad. So we just decided, you know what, we're making it horizontal.
I mean, it's fine, right? I thought it was great anyway. It's just and then I think there was only like a fire other that was missing. Like, that was it, like at the last screen. Other than that, I mean, it played amazing. And so those vines, and I'm not going to ask technically, but the vines that curve, I mean, who solved that problem? Because that's incredible too, right?
Well, this is, getting back to our great graphics designers, what we realized is you could do like a long curved vine and kind of change where on the vine you're drawing it, right? And so that was kind of how we did it. So we could get super smooth. Rather than having many different animation
Yeah,
of a vine swinging. We had one long vine, and we just changed the window that we were looking at it. So the vine kind of made like almost like a J.
That's
And we
so
would
cool.
slide down where we were on the J to show different parts of it. And it was, I mean, that was brilliant, and it was very space efficient, which I liked. And yeah, and again, it just shows like really trying to make the game look and feel real, as close to the arcade game as we could. And I think it plays really well. That's why I was very happy with how that one came out. I will say, you know, as we went forward, usually there were two people on these games, and one person would do the gameplay, and the other person would do what we call the kernel, which is the part of the code that executes on screen. And I don't know if you realize how all this stuff works.
Oh, yeah, I know. I've read a lot about it, but I can't do it. But it's, you've got 73,
76. I think it's 76 machine cycles per scan line. But just for the people that are listening, like TVs don't work like this anymore. But TVs used to be like a little beam that would go across the screen line by line by line. I mean, very fast, obviously, 60 times a second, in fact, but literally drawing line by line by line. We would execute code during that time that the beam is going across the screen, and we had to be sure that it executed just within the length of one line. And no matter what path you took through the code, you had to, make sure it didn't go over. Then you'd wait for the start of the next line. And we would be changing colors and positions of all the objects during the line and from line to line. And that was called the kernel. And that would, like, when the kernel was written, it determined what are the graphics capabilities we can do. How many things per line? How do they move? What does the background look like? Not necessarily the graphic detail, but what are the capabilities we have to display the background?
Yeah.
Like in Jungle Hunt, there's like a multi-dimensional scrolling.
Yes.
So there's like a foreground and a background to give it some depth, right? And stuff like that. So those capabilities are called the kernel. That's actually what I ended up working on. So for fantastic gameplay that feels like the real game, actually, that was usually my collaborator. If it looked as good as it could look for a 2600 game, that was probably me.
So
not the graphic design, but the capabilities.
Both parts are hard, but it seems to me like you did the hardest part, which is getting those kernels.
I don't know. Switching over to Battlezone for a second, which is another game that I worked on. I don't know if you ever played that one.
Oh yeah, I played it.
So
loved it.
My collaborator on that game was a guy named Brad Rice, and like Battlezone is, it's like a 360-degree thing where you're turning, and the objects have to move as you turn. That's trigonometry, right? And so Brad Rice wrote these really short subroutines that were approximating trigonometric functions.
Wow.
So we could make that feel right. I couldn't have done that. Not a chance.
Both jobs were hard. Okay, let's just be
both jobs were hard. Both jobs were hard. I think it just required somewhat different types of skills to a certain extent. They both had to be very, optimizing and stuff like that. But like, in order to really get the most out of the graphics, we really had to push the limits hard and experiment and just keep trying to see if we could squeeze a little bit more out of it. Just to, like, if I could get 2 more cycles out of this range of code, I could do something that otherwise I couldn't do. And so I would spend hours trying to do that.
That's and you were obviously working long hours to get this stuff done and having fun, I guess, too, right? At the same time. It was
a lot of fun. I mean, it was a lot of fun. Like I wouldn't have traded anything for that, even though I put in tons of time. It was like we were having fun working, and it was a collaborative environment as I described, and we were all doing the same thing. Everyone was really working that hard, and like I said, really high standards of quality. But we were having fun. We had a real fun corporate culture. We did company outings and stuff like that as well, and so it was great.
So I know you probably didn't work on these, but I want to ask you a question about them anyway. Sure. Jungle Hunt was the first game that the first one of those Atari arcade games that had an actual title screen, like a logo, like the Jungle Hunt logo comes over. Do you remember what, like, if there was a decision to do that, or was it just like, hey, this would be cool if we could just make a cool logo to come up on the screen to show the title of the game?
I think it was a matter of whether there was space and things like that. Like we had one in Phoenix, we had to cut it. Like we really wanted to do it for every game. In Phoenix, we made the decision to cut it, to cut anything fancy. We just had like a little logo on the screen. So I don't, I think that was always the goal, because arcade games have like an attract mode.
Yep.
It's what's playing when you're walking by to get you to want to play the game. And we wanted to have an attract mode in our games, so it felt like you're in an arcade. And, we did have it like in Joust, which is another game I worked on. We had like the rising letters.
It looks like the arcade game almost. Like it's pretty cool. It's pretty amazing.
We were able to mimic that pretty well. And so I think we always had the goal of trying to do something that looked like the arcade game one, or at least something that we could create that had the same feeling. But like I said, sometimes it had to get chopped, because we had to make the decision: do we keep that in there, or do we go to something simple and have better gameplay or graphics? So
this is within that 32K or whatever amount you guys were.
Yeah.
So, okay, so anything else about the 2600 that you remember that you want to talk about?
No, I think I don't know if you want to transition and talk about the 7800, but all of our frustrations with the 2600 led us to design a much better hardware system with the 7800.
And
so
Golson designed it, right? So Steve designed the hardware.
Not single-handedly. It was a whole team of people, yeah.
Okay, so how did that work? Could you give me a little bit of insight?
So I think, well, obviously, we had done games for the 2600, and we had also written games for the 5200, and so which had much better hardware capabilities, but it was clunky in many ways. And so, we had really brilliant people, and we had made hardware because we had built, arcade games and things like that. And we realized, and we proposed to Atari, we want to build a whole game system. And the thing that's going to be great about this, because the one thing we didn't like about the 5200 is it didn't play the 2600 games.
Right.
The 2600 was the most popular system. It had the most games out there. Families had invested literally hundreds of dollars, which at that time was a lot of money, in their games. And if you want to sell them a new system, you can't tell them, throw away all your games and buy new ones.
Exactly.
So 2600 compatibility was critical for the 7800. But at the same time, we wanted to be able to design new games that could take advantage of all these new hardware capabilities. So we designed a VLSI chip. This was like in the early days of chip design. We actually had a consultant who was like one of the world's leading innovators at the time in VLSI chip design. And we had a team of people that designed a graphics chip. It included the capabilities of the, graphics and sound chip of the 2600, as well as all new capabilities completely separate for the 7800. And the 7800, could be built with much better color, many more objects, relatively a lot of, memory, a faster processor. And we didn't end up having to do any of this rule break on the 7800 games that we did on 2600. It was designed keep in mind, we knew what arcade games looked like and what the range of capabilities you needed to do a game like Robotron versus Ms. Pac-Man versus
Robotron feels to me like it was a goal when that was being designed.
Well, that was our favorite game. If you polled the people at GCC, that was collectively our favorite game, was Robotron, because it was awesome.
It was awesome.
I don't know. I can't describe it any other way, because it starts slow and easy and gets intense. And I would play Robotron during my lunch break in the middle of the day, and I would break a sweat. I was playing that game so intensely. I loved it, So it was just, I think there's an intensity to Robotron that very few games can match.
And you could not recreate that on the 2600 in any reasonable way.
Impossible.
Right? Even hard on the 5200 too, probably.
Yeah, no. But so the thing that I think was great is, because one, we had all this experience with all these different kinds of games. that, collectively needed all different kinds of capabilities. And we knew all the constraints of the 2600 and where all the problems were. We're trying to, use a system that primitive. It helped us really think, what do we really want? Like, what's our wish list of capabilities? To be able to do all these games and to make them feel really like the arcade game,
Right.
and to have it not be ridiculously hard to program. So those were the goals. We had a team of people doing the chip, the hardware, and the software. Right, I was on the software side of that.
Did you write the kernel for the like? Are there kernels as well?
It didn't work that way. It didn't work. We didn't have to change code on the fly in the 7800. It was like you would everything was about the gameplay. It was all about the gameplay. The graphics just did it for you. So like it was just a very different. It was like a dream.
Right. I mean, that's kind of. I mean, doing there's a piece of software out there called Atari 700 Basic, and it really is kind of like a basic language, but it's really a little bit like assembly language. It just it has a go-to function. It doesn't have a lot of functions, but it kind of gives you the difference between it and there's one for the Atari 2600 as well. Atari 2600 is really kind of like someone's game engine, like it's a kernel, and you can manipulate the kernel a lot, but it doesn't have as much as you do. The 700 one is basically I can put sprites all over the screen wherever I want.
Yeah,
and I'm guessing it sort of felt the same, right? It kind of felt similar.
Yeah, exactly. And so you just it was just built to do all this stuff. So from a programming perspective, it was relatively easy. Certainly to make it look the way you wanted it to look was easy. So the emphasis was all on the gameplay, and of course we wanted the gameplay to be perfect. Look at 7800 Xevious. Do you ever play that?
Yeah, of course.
Game?
I've played them all. I mean, just to be honest with you.
Yeah. Okay. So Xevious, very, very detailed arcade game, like tons of detail. And the guys who worked on that, they played that, they found all those details. Again, we didn't have the source code, so they played everything, explored everything, and got all the details. I mean, that game looks perfect.
It does, and it's actually better than the Nintendo because there's way more sprites on the screen. Like it actually plays like the original.
Exactly, and so that's just such an impressive job. And again, the emphasis was all on the gameplay. Like the basic capabilities to put those graphical images on the screen was built into the hardware. So I think the fact that we had slogged through the 2600 and dealt with all the challenges and problems. I mean, we were successful, but it wasn't easy. It was hard work. I think it just gave us the idea of we got to really build something for the 7800 that's just going to be a lot easier for programmers.
Oh, yeah.
And make it easy to get those graphic capabilities on the screen. And then, that first wave of 7800 games, I think they're all beautiful. Xevious,
there's the
Robotron,
first 11. There's I believe it's 11, right?
I think so.
They're beautiful. Yeah, they're almost perfect. And they all have, and they just talk a little bit the title screen. They all have a very similar look and feel to them too, as if they were built by someone who cared about what the look would be like. Okay, two questions about that. So, was there how did it feel internally when you guys were on that mission to get all those things done to launch this system that was going to come out 1984? What was that like?
It was again, we were working really hard. And it's always challenging when you're writing software for a hardware system that isn't done yet. So there would be changes to the chip, there would be changes to the hardware. We would say, okay, this didn't work. Was it a hardware bug or was it a software bug? Because it was all changing at the same time. But again, the environment at the company was so collaborative. It was just try to solve the problem together. The hardware team, the software team, we're all working in one space. We're all working together. We'd say, hey, it would be great if you could really do this. Okay, we're going to change it so it does that on the hardware side. I mean, it was a lot of that.
Cool. That's cool.
Yeah. So it was a really we kind of viewed it as all one gigantic project rather than many different projects, right?
Right. So you could go back and forth and say, oh, we kind of need to tweak this so this game will work. Yeah. And there's actually an opportunity to fix the hardware at the time, possibly, right?
Yeah, there is at some point. At some point you can't. At some point it's locked in and now the stuff's being manufactured. But in the early days, when we're and so there was a guy, crazy guy. And so he wrote something that would emulate the graphics chip of the 7800, so we could get started designing the software before the chip was actually through the fab and built. And like, it was this massive project that it was just like something that never shipped to anyone. It was just an internal development tool.
Wow.
And I remember he was like, you know, it was crazy, this thing. But I mean, it let us get started doing some software development. And I remember the moments when like the first, you know, real images came up on a screen from the first real hardware and software. And it's like, it really.
Were you like all you guys in a room, or was just like behind
we were all gathered around one monitor, one TV.
Oh, that's incredible!
This is the first one. Like, let's go make sure it works.
That's awesome. And so you worked on Desert Falcon. Is that a game that Atari designed, or that you guys came up with? That was
an original game. Okay, so we had, you know, there was a game called Zaxxon.
Yep.
In the arcades, which is like same kind of 3D perspective, and we didn't do Zaxxon. We didn't have the rights to do Zaxxon for the Atari 2600 or 5200, and so we never did that 3D perspective kind of game. So we said, we want to do one. Let's do one original game, and that was Desert Falcon. And so the general look, I mean, it doesn't look like Zaxxon in some ways, but the idea of that 3D perspective from the side, you can gauge how high things are because there's a shadow. And then we just went crazy on the gameplay in terms of, you know, both, you know, we decided I don't remember how we decided. We decided very early on that it was going to be this Egypt motif.
Yeah.
And then, you know, Desert Falcon pretty quickly became the name. But the idea, you know, how the gameplay worked kept on evolving, right? So there's, you know, things to fly through and around. And then we ended up deciding like the bird, which is like the character that you're controlling, the Falcon, was really important. And we gave that bird a ton of personality. So if you spend time with that game, I mean, the bird walks, hops, swims, flies, flips over and dies on its back when it gets shot or killed.
That's amazing. I have to admit,
it bounces on the ground. I mean, there was personality to that thing.
I never owned that one, and you're making me want to go back and explore it completely because I thought it was an Atari design, like throwaway, and I'm like, it kind of honestly, I was like, well, you know, it doesn't interest me as much. But now that I know that you guys designed it as an original, that's a totally different story, right? Like that's like, that's fascinating, right?
I appreciate that. And so, you know, if you think about Zaxxon, you know, it's kind of a shoot 'em up game. Fly around, shoot 'em, you know, kind of avoid things, shoot at things. And we have all that in Desert Falcon. But we added another layer, which is there's these hieroglyphs on the ground that the bird collects. And different combinations give you all different kinds of either bonuses or superpowers. And so you can kind of just focus on that and do all these different things, and there's tons of combinations.
I feel like I've missed something incredible here that I need to go back to. I apologize for that, by the way. This is great. It's very fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the challenge with an original game. Like with all those arcade games, people kind of had an expectation, and it also kind of bounded what we could do. It's like, hey, like we're going to make this feel like Phoenix, or make it feel like, you know, whatever, Pac-Man or Ms., you know, Pac-Man. But that's it. Like, we're not doing something different. But I think this was maybe one of the only original games for the home systems that we did. We were working on one for the 7800. I don't think it ever got finished. You know, when everything collapsed. Yeah, this was the only one that really got finished, an original game. And so it's challenging because, like, there's no limit. You can make it do whatever you want. So we really...
Yeah, I am super excited now to go back and play.
The graphic look of it is amazing, by the way. When you look at it, there's like, you know, there's a big sphinx that's shooting things at you from its eyes, and there's these pots of fire that go up and down. And
that's fantastic. I cannot really believe I have not done this. Okay, so now you've totally inspired me to go play this.
Let me know what you think after you play
will.
it.
Absolutely. Now I'm going to dive into it because this sounds awesome. I have a 7800 right next to me over here that I'm going to go plug it into. So you made a 2600 version of that as well. That wasn't you, but someone else made
we did not make that. I don't know how that happened. Okay. That was after us. I don't think we had anything to do with that. Okay. That was in the post Jack Trammell kind of Atari world.
Right.
And I don't know what happened.
So
I really was not involved at
we only have a few more minutes. So
yeah.
how did I mean I think this is an easy thing to imagine what the answer is, but when that whole thing fell apart, when Atari decided not to buy this or not do this or whatever happened with the deal, right? It fell through, or Jack wouldn't pay you guys. What is that like with you guys when you're there? Like, what are you feeling, or is it the end of an era for you guys, or?
It was, although we had already started on the Macintosh, right?
Okay.
So in '84, the original Macintosh shipped, but before the Macintosh, there was a computer called the Lisa.
Oh yeah.
It was an Apple Lisa. It was like an office machine, and it looked kind of like a Macintosh. It was a big, bulky thing. It was designed for office workers. It was not as elegant as the Macintosh, but we bought one, and we were playing around with it, and we were designing a game for it, which we thought this is kind of silly because it's an office machine. But then the Macintosh came out, and we changed the game effort to be focused on the Macintosh. So we actually designed a game. It's called Ground Zero.
Oh, really?
Kind of like Missile Command, but from scratch, called Ground Zero for the Macintosh. And that game was, I believe, it was published. So we thought we would just expand what we were doing to also do stuff for the Macintosh, do games or who knows what for the Macintosh. And so then in '85, Jack Tramiel bought Atari. And, Atari was not well managed financially. And so he bought it. They were in trouble. He bought it. And I remember Kevin Kerman going out to meet him and saying, hey, we have this contract with you guys, and you have to pay us all this money, and we're going to keep doing these games. And he said, I'm not going to do that. And Kevin said, well, I'll sue you. And he goes, go ahead. Kevin made a lawsuit, so I don't think that would have stopped him. But we quickly realized, like, in the end, he wasn't going to send us any more money. It might take us years to do this in court, and we had to go somewhere else. And also, I think Kevin said, I can't do business with this guy.
No,
it's not someone we could do business with. And so we said, okay, let's go hard on the Macintosh stuff, but not just games. And as you might know, we designed an internal hard drive.
That's right.
The old Macintosh is called the Hyperdrive, which shipped in '85. And so I think the company just got, we were bummed out about the games, and we didn't know what was going to happen to the 7800 because it had been launched, or had been announced, but not yet shipped. And, we all turned our sights to the Macintosh. And actually, I shifted my whole career at that time, and I went into sales, because when we were doing video games, we were all just engineering and product development. We didn't, everything was licensed to Atari, and so we had.
You didn't really need a sales department, right? Yeah, you're all you have one customer, right?
Our own products, our own brand. We needed sales and marketing and everything else you need to do that. And so they asked for people to volunteer to go into sales, and I actually transitioned towards the end of my software development time. I became the head of all the consumer software development for us. So I didn't finish Desert Falcon for us. I kind of halfway through, I became the manager of the whole team. And so, I was interested in doing something other than running software. So when they asked for volunteers to go into sales, I raised my hand, and I ended up going to sales, and actually I ended up doing international sales, and that's a whole nother saga. You could write a book about GCC, by the way.
I think someone should. Someone should make a documentary, because it is such an amazing. To me, it's an amazing story of such a great time.
A hugely successful product, by the way. The Hyperdrive product was unbelievably successful, and so that's a whole nother chapter in the company's history. But anyway, in the end, we just got so focused on this Macintosh opportunity, which just seemed so exciting. It was all brand new, and it was just awesome, and no one else was doing the stuff we were doing. We got Apple, even though we were installing something inside the Macintosh that it wasn't designed to take, we got Apple to agree that we didn't void their warranty, and then our business, just took off.
That's amazing. And you obviously are semi-genius, because you were able to, and maybe a genius because you were able to transition from a purely technical role to this sort of role that takes a lot more emotional intelligence, right? Like a sales role is very different. Did you want to do, was that something you thought about before you even went technical?
I don't know if I didn't think about it, but it's kind of led to why I ended up going into management. So what I kind of realized, and maybe I wouldn't have articulated it this way at the time, but certainly in hindsight, is that, computers are boring because they do exactly what you tell them. You might tell them the wrong thing and they won't work, but they just very reliably do exactly what you tell them. Humans are not. Humans are way more complex. They don't do what you tell them. You could tell them the same thing 3 days in a row and they're going to do different things. They're much more complex systems. And I was like, I'm intrigued about how to manage and work with humans because it's so much harder.
That's interesting, actually.
And that's
really
why
cool.
I ended up, like, the rest of my career has all been on the business side of technology, working in sales, marketing, and product management, working with engineers oftentimes, but I really just enjoyed the people part of it and just the complexity of working with people.
Oh, I bet it is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
So does anyone? Obviously, you don't really announce that you did any of this stuff. I mean, again, it's around a couple places.
I don't hide from it, but I'm not a promoter, I guess.
Does anyone ever ask you about it? Does anyone ever? I mean, does it ever come up?
I will tell you, it comes up every once in a while. But one time, and this was quite a number of years ago. I mean, keep in mind, we were writing these games 40 years ago. Right? This was a long time ago.
I know.
So probably 15 or 20 years ago. So it was still pretty much long after we finished. I got contacted by some guy on the internet who was the world record holder on Phoenix.
Really? On your version of Phoenix?
On my version, 2600 Phoenix, world record holder. He was going to have like a new record attempt, and he wants to know if I wanted to come watch. I didn't, but I did watch like a video of it, like he was streaming it in some way, and then but I did offer to sign a cartridge, and I got John Morasic, my collaborator.
Oh, cool!
And we bought him a copy of 2600 Phoenix, and we each signed it and sent it to him, and we made his day.
Oh, that's fantastic! That's cool, man. Well, I know we're out of time. I probably would love to talk to you more about this sometime if you have any time to do it.
I'd be happy to. It's fun.
Especially after I play Desert Falcon and then come back and ask you for tips. But this is awesome. Steve had said that you would be willing to talk, and you absolutely were willing to talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Happy to do it.
Michael's an awesome dude, isn't he, Steve? He seems really to not have any of that sort of been beaten down by Atari in him.
Yeah. I think you had something interesting to say about that too. You made an observation about.
You know what? I'll let you know that. When I was listening to that, I was also listening to on tape the Howard Scott Warshaw on tape. It's on Audible. Howard Scott Warshaw Once Upon Atari book. And by listening to both of those at the same time, I came to the realization that GCC really was Atari's new development arm for this new non-Nolan Atari, the one they gave freedom to. But internally, they didn't get that. So it seemed like Atari needed one of those. They just didn't realize they had one internally also, and they kind of beat them down a little bit.
Yeah, no, it did feel like the guys feel like GCC had the autonomy to go and kind of do amazing things, and they did, right? They kind of became the new heart of what Atari did. They programmed most of those VCS games that we remember as being the Renaissance, Miss Pac-Man and beyond, where you're like, oh wait, Atari can do great stuff. Right. After Pac-Man and kind of, and I think people like Defender, but there was always that hiccup with Defender where the ship disappeared and stuff, and we were feeling like Atari was really not, state of the art anymore. And then all of a sudden here comes the 5200 and these great games with VCS, and I always wondered how that renaissance happened, and it appears that they outsourced a lot of it.
Yeah, not all of it, obviously. There's not all of it. I mean, there's internally lots of great stuff was going on, but yeah, it also seems like you seem to poop on Atari a lot in this interview, Steve.
Well, it's not that, what I was trying to get at was that, again, it's like, it just feels like GCC had something special. At the same time, you observed that Atari was sort of on its on its, it was sort of pushed back a little bit. There were great people there, but there didn't seem to be especially in the consumer division, the ability to get everything done that they wanted to get done. So I wasn't, I do have kind of, mixed feelings about what Atari did after Pac-Man. Certainly, it's always been that way. And I always wondered what was the special sauce that turned it around. And now I believe the special sauce is GCC. And like you observed, and what I was trying to get at in the interview is that they had something special there, just like kind of like Nolan Bushnell did, when Atari started, because GCC didn't have to have, Michael Feinstein becomes the first salesman or the marketing guy when they had to go out and do that. But before that, they were like in the Bushnell era, they didn't have a lot of marketing when it came to their arcade games. They didn't have to, right? There's very few avenues. You need to talk to, maybe there's a couple magazines like Replay, and there's some AMOA like shows and stuff and distributors, but you're not really marketing to consumers. So they kind of had the freedom to kind of do whatever and test it out. And it feels like GCC was a bit the same. They didn't have to market to anybody. They just had to make stuff for Atari. They didn't need a marketing and sales department to adhere to. And maybe some of that was kind of like the Bushnell era where the engineering team can just kind of go crazy for what they want to do and come up with amazing stuff. And the timelines are different and all that stuff.
Yeah, excuse me, sorry for interrupting. That's exactly what I got from that. That the Atari guys, all these brilliant guys hired by Atari, had to wade through this morass of political stuff. Not like, for instance, on ET, the marketing team at Atari, not just marketing, because marketing we'll call it marketing, but it's not, like the team that was doing the negotiating the deal with Spielberg knew months beforehand they're negotiating the deal, but they were only told to make the game like after the deal was signed. So there's no pre-work. Like, they just did not understand what it took to make a game. But when it came to GCC, they just let them do stuff, and they came out with great stuff. Like, there just seemed to be like handling them a little bit different, and that allowed the GCC guys to see things from a different perspective. And also, you were told they were paid well.
They were paid well. Yeah, you said that. They were so prolific in how many things they made. They made about 80 plus games for 5200, 2600, 7800 at a time when we believed, Jeff, you're disappearing.
I'm apologize. It's sorry about the disappearance. My computer is having a little problem here for a second, and I need to move something.
It's disappearing. Is what it's doing.
I know. We'll just. This will be a funny intake outtake. Probably won't move it. Yeah, my computer was falling, so now it's not falling. Okay.
So I here's the thing. One of the things that came out of this was a very new appreciation for the game Desert Falcon, and I want to talk about that. But I have a review that I wrote. And I think you said that you would play Desert Falcon, as I read the review, as some sort of a kind of like freeform jazz odyssey.
We're going to do that.
Experimental video thing. So let's try
that.
This is Desert Falcon. In the game, you play as a falcon. You fire with the left button and use power-ups with the right button. You can fly through an isometric landscape at multiple altitudes, just like Zaxxon or the better Blue Max. But you can also walk on the ground and swim through the water. Your job is to fly through each level and kill the Sphinx boss at the end. While you fly, enemies of many types fly at you, while you dodge various sized pyramids and other objects. Bonus items and hieroglyphics are spread across the floor of the desert. You gain powers by picking up 3 hieroglyphics. The game feels strange at first. It's like a lost game from an age that never existed. The up and down Y-axis movement of your Falcon makes it not easy to gauge exactly how high you are in relation to the enemies that fly towards you, so the controls are immediately off-putting. The game also requires you to land, hop around, and pick stuff up, which is not normal at all, especially for the time. Gems, precious bars of minerals, and hieroglyphics are spread across the randomly generated levels. To get them, you lower your bird to the ground, where he starts hopping across the landscape and/or swimming through the water. Gems and bars are good for points, while hieroglyphics award superpowers after you've collected 3 of them. The instruction manual mentions 8 different hieroglyphics, like Ankh, Bull, and Eye, and 10 superpowers, like Air Bomb, Decoy, Omnicide, but which to collect to create which superpower is nowhere in the instruction manual. All of these powers are built out of 3 hieroglyphics, and the common ones that I found, like Speed Up, Fast Shoot, and Skip Level, are not even mentioned in the instruction manual. Furthermore, not only do you need to collect them, but you need to read the bottom of the screen to see if they are enacted automatically, i.e. free points, or need to be deployed with the right fire button. And even then, if you get one that is called something like Kill Sphinx, you need to have the patience to not use it until the end of the level. Because of this, the game requires both quick reflexes and your ability to recall recipes you have learned to create certain powers and mix both those skills at the same time. Your reflexes and brain are taxed in a sort of pat my head, rub my stomach challenge. Given the isometric view, you are also fighting enemies at multiple altitudes and dodging randomly generated objects at the same time. It is a lot to ask of players, but I think if this was released in the Golden Age, it would have been seen as a brilliant game that offered arcade gamers a fantastic challenge. I could imagine Bill Kunkel or Arnie Katz raving about it in the pages of Electronic Games just because it offered something new and a great challenge. But this game did not come out in 1984. It was released for the 7800 VCS and 8-bit in 1987, when the Tramiels owned Atari. At the time, Atari game design felt old and suspect. They really hadn't been in the game for almost 3 years. Even to me, an Atari 7800 owner from Christmas 1986, much of the game design in the Tramiel era felt suspect to me, like it was from a different time. Long gone were the lore-filled Silicon Valley buildings with Atari programmers hacking away on games while Nolan Bushnell fueled them with a steady diet of beer parties and hot tubs. Long gone was the Cassar era, where guys like Todd Fry and Howard Scott Warshaw were bouncing ideas and their very bodies off the walls while thumbing their noses at Warner Brass, smoking joints, and creating crazy like Sword Quest Earthworld. No, this game came out in the no-nonsense era of Atari Corp., a time when games were an afterthought to selling 68,000 base computers, a time when Nintendo and Sega had taken up the mantle of video games, and the ideas of the games of the Golden Age felt quaint by comparison. Nintendo and Sega seemed to exude a love for games. Everything about those companies felt like they geared towards making better and better and more fantastic and immersive games at every turn. By 1987, by contrast, Atari Corp. Still had the 2600 going, released the mothballed 7800, and announced the XEGS, another game system based on the Atari 8-bit. It was a crazy strategy to support all of them at the same time. All of this selling for rock-bottom prices and honestly with very little care for the nuances that were so important from Golden Age Atari. Game boxes were cheap, manuals were short and flimsy, cartridge labels black and white. It was all designed to sell as many units of whatever as possible to as many customers as possible at the cheapest prices possible, the Tramiel way. This was very noticeable. While Nintendo and Sega games were easy to find at almost any store, Ataris were buried, hidden, or non-existent. Even at the Federated Group, a chain of stores Atari purchased, you'd be hard-pressed to find a complete set of any games or their software, while the salespeople knew next to nothing about the product lines. Atari Corp. Did not seem like a serious player in video games. Instead, it felt like they were selling off old stock to fund their next Atari ST monitor or disk drive upgrade. So when this came out, for me, it was easy to write off as just another Atari Corp. Crappy product. 1987 was too late for these types of games. People wanted Mario Brothers, Zelda, Metroid, Contra, Shinobi, Final Fantasy. No one needed a Zaxxon clone where you played a bird and hopped around on the ground. I don't think I ever bought this game when I had my original 7800 back in 1986 and 1987, but I did get a copy with my 7800 Blowout Super Package in 1995. Still, I rarely if ever played it. And now, 34 years later, I realize I must have made a mistake. In our recent interview with Michael Feinstein from GCC, he told us that he started the game with another programmer in 1984. He went on to describe how it was developed at GCC and the enormous effort and care the GCC team put into the game. I was shocked when I heard this. I'd been wrong the whole time. This was a game from the golden age. Desert Falcon was not some kind of one-off throwaway new title from Atari created in 1987. It was instead the first original 7800 game, written for the 1984 launch of the system. It was created by GCC, the genius minds who invented Miss Pac-Man and Food Fight, and developed 80 or so Atari 2600, 5200, and 7800 titles for Atari Inc. from 1982 to 1984 as a kind of outsourced secret weapon. It might not have seen a release until 1987, when Atari Corp created versions for the 2600 and Atari 8-bit, neither of which were made by GCC, but its pedigree was planted firmly in the era of Atari Inc. With that realization, it was easy to see the game in a new light. It was designed to test and show off all aspects of the system itself, to debug the hardware, to push it to its limits. It was like a moment in one of those dumb movies where the jock removes the girl's glasses and suddenly she is pretty. She was pretty the whole time. It just took the jock to look at her with his eyes unblinded. For the past few days, I've been obsessed with this game. It's a showcase for all that could have been done with a 7800. The action is fast, with lots of objects on the screen. The game feels like a cross between Zaxxon and Xevious, with the hieroglyphic power-ups adding a deeper third dimension. It utilizes both fire buttons and a whole range of movements from the joystick. Color palette shifting is used to make each new level look more and more interesting. The sounds are very well done for a TIA-based game, even incorporating music at the beginning of the game and a pulsing soundtrack as the levels are played. There are so many options when it comes to power-ups, it's almost mind-boggling. This truly is a game of discovery, but also randomness, but also deep and challenging. It's not perfect by any means, but once you get into it, it feels engrossing to try to figure it all out. In many ways, this game is a poster child for what we refer to as the vertical blank. It represents what could have been. It was created by the right people at the wrong time and then buried for years. If this is what GCC was making in 1984, I just wonder what amazing stuff they would have pushed the 7800 to do by 1987. What wonders did we miss because Jack Tramiel didn't understand or care about video games? Would all of our games be called old man cringe by the younger generation if Atari and GCC were blowing the roof off the joint with amazing games in 1987, instead of rolling out what looked like, on first inspection anyway, an adventurous tech demo with the name Desert Falcon? But now Desert Falcon holds a new place for me. I crave playing it to learn all the combinations and see what lies beyond level 4, the highest level I've achieved. I know now that this is the last great project that the video game masters at GCC made for Atari, and Atari didn't even care. In July 1984, GCC must have felt abandoned by Atari as developers, just like we fans did. In many ways, GCC are the mirror image of Atari fans. Maybe that's why I'm so fascinated by them. In many ways, they are we and we are them. And that's why I'll be mounting my Desert Falcon and flying it many, many more times in the future. I'll try to catalog all the hieroglyphics. I'll try to figure out the best ways to get through each level. I'll shoot the end level boss and then collect the gems in the bonus stage beyond and move on to the next challenge. I'll get past level 4 and I'll make it to the next level and beyond. It's a golden age game, of course, so I know there is no real ending, but instead it's a fatalistic exercise. The cliche of the journey being more important than the destination, except it's true. Like many games from the golden age, an existential version of life itself, where you can play the game even perfectly for a time, but in the end, there's only one way out, one final destination. And to me, that final destination is no further than directly inside the vertical
I
blank.
agree 100% with your review.
Thanks, Jeff.
That was fun. I think I got to where you got while I was playing.
It's actually
4.
a really fun game, isn't it? That I never explored, and I don't know why I never explored it.
I don't know. I think it was just at the time we were looking for something else. The funny thing is, it's graphically, it looks to me to be on par with the motorcycle racing game you got. Enduro
Sega.
Racer on the Sega Master System.
Oh, not a sci-fi. Okay, you mean like
Yeah, no,
Enduro Racer?
the better one, the better game, Enduro Racer on the Sega Master System, which is basically the same exact graphics are basically identical, really.
Really? I think Excite Bike is a good game, but anyway.
No, I'm just saying. To me, that game is the isometric racing game. It's not
Oh
Excite
yeah,
Bike.
okay.
I'm saying, yeah, it's. I love Excite Bike. Like Excite Bike's one of my favorite games. In fact, Excite Truck was pretty good. Anyway, so that shows a lot of what GCC could have done. Let's talk about a little about what they did do when they made the arcade games. They tried to focus on trying to keep them as close as possible, but they didn't want to make a sort of version. So we heard a lot about Atari developers not being given a lot of information for marketing about, like, weren't told make Pac-Man just like Pac-Man had to have a black background. They were said don't make a black background, right? Well, GCC, they didn't really get any of that weird information, like misinformation back and forth. They just did. So their idea was to make games that were as close as possible with cool stuff like track screens and title screens, like you mentioned. So do you want to go through the other games, that what we think about the other games that GCC made, the ones that Michael worked on? Let's talk a little bit about Phoenix.
Yeah.
Phoenix, to me, is one of those games that we never had. We had basically moved on to the Atari 8-bit at that point, very close, really moved on to the Atari 8-bit computer. No Phoenix game ever came out for that. The games that we played that were close to Phoenix was basically Demon Attack on the 8-bit and the 2600. Very close. You know, the Phoenix, there are a couple levels that are close, but also Phoenix includes the shield and includes the boss level.
Yeah, it's got the mothership boss level, which I think is very ambitious to try to do on the 2600, and it's pretty amazing, actually. I agree with you. That's it's not as finely tuned as Demon Attack is. And Demon Attack is very, very. I mean, Atari sued Imagic because of Phoenix and Demon Attack, and so you got to compare. It feels like you have to compare the two.
I do see similarities.
Is a very compelling game. Phoenix, though, has its own charm that is just as valid, I think, and especially with the boss level, I think it has something special there that they tried to do. And you know that Michael's talking about doing Vanguard at the same time. Vanguard is also a game with a boss level. It's right. Kind of interesting to me that those two games came out at a similar time. He said it came out Christmas 1982. The date is 1983. I think Phoenix came out later in 1983. But it's interesting that those boss level games, were being created back then, even though people don't necessarily give them credit for it.
Those were getting close to what
because they're old
the NES was doing.
Jeff, they're old man cringe.
Old man cringe. I know everything I do is old man cringe now. Big deal.
Embrace it.
I'm embracing old man cringe. There's nothing else I could do but embrace it, right? So let's talk a little bit about Jungle Hunt. Jungle Hunt has all of the stages, and I do remember playing this game before a camping trip, just like you mentioned to me the other day.
So I mentioned to you this the other day. I think we got this right before we went on one of our camping trips with Dad to look for gold. I remember buying it in the summer of 1983 and being very excited about it. And that's also I think we had the Vectrex at that time too, and we had the superchargers. So, but we were still excited when Atari, because of Miss Pac-Man coming out in like March '83. I think we were very encouraged to keep looking at the arcade games that Atari was making, the translations. Little did we know that GCC was producing almost all of them, which is right. Which I didn't know until a few years ago. Which is another reason why I'm fascinated by what they produce, because it feels like they had almost a manufacturing machine to manufacture good-looking arcade games for the Atari VCS, which is pretty incredible.
You know what? Here's something. The Atari had separated out their arcade game programmers and the home game people, so they were almost in competition with one another. But at GCC, they were all the same people.
Yep.
So there wasn't this.
The way it should have been. That was dumb.
The way it should have always been, and the way it was with Nolan.
I mean, GCC also had people working on the 5200 and the 8-bit. I think they even did some of the Atari soft games. I mean, everyone in the room together, all working on these different platforms, all creating stuff, bouncing ideas off there, not really competing with, well, who knows? We don't know all of it, but I mean, feeling as if it's that almost Bushnell era where everybody's just trying to figure out what to do, and they're all together and trying to hack through this stuff and make cool things. And it's not these big separations and these silos and all this stuff that corporateness brings to try to make things more efficient and put process to it. And sometimes I think I don't know, I think some of that chaos is what generated some of that great stuff.
So Joust is actually very good. Also, the only thing about Joust is that the eggs float up, so it makes the game different. They don't float down, and it makes the game much more difficult.
Oh, it's really hard. Yeah, it's really hard. But it does feel like Joust, which is...
Oh, it feels like Joust. Yeah, I mean, these guys got the feel down with no flicker.
Yeah, there's no flicker in any of these games, as far as I can tell. The most impressive to me is Battlezone, I think, just from the perspective of... And it does look a lot like Robot Pink as well. Like, those two games are very similar. I just wish that Battlezone they had made like into Star Raiders, because it is very... When you play it, like, oh... In the arcade, this makes sense. You're playing for 90 seconds or whatever, and you're blowing up these things, and you're looking through the viewfinder, and it's like an amazing VR almost experience, right? With that arcade game machine. I think it's one of those games that shows the translation from arcade game to home console in that era, shows the seams the most, because it's really, really technically fantastic, but not that much fun to play. It's just kind of like, okay, I could go on forever.
The same as the arcade game, though, where
it's just basically was a 25-cent, hit of adrenaline, and the video game is very nice, and it just shows the limitations of that type of game. Whereas with Phoenix or Jungle Hunt or even Joust, those games feel as if you could keep playing for a really long time, because they're engrossing and also have multiple stages. Or have a challenge that keeps getting different and more interesting, and that's why those games, I think, are seen. I know Battlezone is a lot of love, but they never actually expanded on it that much either, right? There's never any really where to go.
Yes, the next version of those, or these versions to compete, had to add something extra, and still with the 7800, although they didn't make Battlezone. They made Joust, things like that, but they didn't add that one element. So I think Star Raiders to Battlezone would have made it that much better. Star Raider style, a little bit more tactical, to increase the play, because they were still making quarter munchers, and you could see with Desert Falcon, it wasn't as much of a quarter muncher. Yes, there's lots of deaths, but you had more to do in the game. It was
I think Desert Falcon is a trend, because now we know that it was made by GCC, which I never knew before, and it was one of the first games for 700. It feels like it's one of those transitionary games, right? It does have kind of little adventuring elements, but is a very complex shooter at the same time. It's not a perfect game by any means, but it is compelling to play. And once you play it in the light of it being like the 7800's first and only original game by the people who made the 7800, I think it begs to be played from a historical perspective, just to see what could have been, right? Imagine those first 11. I still wonder if those first 11 GCC games for the 7800 were finished. It feels like Galaga, while it has all the levels, that Galaga is a bit of a tech demo for how to build Galaga, an alpha version. Yes. It's finished, but they could have added many more graphics. That there's lots of bonus ships and stuff and different graphics in Galaga that there's no reason why they couldn't have fit into.
They're missing.
It feels like it just feels not finished. And And I don't know, but I don't know if Desert Falcon was actually finished either. Maybe it was, or it's got to. I think all these games got to like probably a beta stage at least, and maybe they were done, but maybe they could have used another revision, or maybe they could have used being play tested by consumer tested or stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like the things that didn't happen because Atari Corp, just released whatever they had. I mean, seemingly, right? They released what they had and started building more stuff in a way that didn't feel like their heart was actually in it, the way that it would have been if GCC and Atari Inc. at that time were at the helm. I mean, imagine the 1700 going back to Howard Scott Warshaw and those guys, and them getting to build games. And now they've got this palette to just do whatever they want with sprites.
Whatever they want, right?
Yeah. I mean, what if Sword Quest? The next Sword Quest came out of the 1700. It would have been Zelda. It would have been an amazing game, right? It would have been an action adventure game with, what if Airworld actually ended up, was it Airworld the one that did come out? What if that was a 700 game?
Those are things that
they live in the vertical blank.
But also the only one good thing about the 1700 is that, and just like you're trying to work on, the people who are creating homebrew games now are really have been for a while and are starting to take advantage of it.
Oh yeah,
right.
It's really cool, and that's the best thing is seeing now people start like realizing, oh, this thing is pretty powerful, and it should have been Atari's next step to do, and here's some really cool games we can make for it. But having said that, and just want to transition a little bit. You've been working on some STOS stuff, and you told me something pretty exciting about another upcoming podcast we may have.
Yes, I started work on some STOS stuff last Wednesday night, and right as I started, I got this message from Francois Leonet. I forget how to say his last name. He is the person who created STOS for Mandarin, and he sent me a message on Facebook, just like serendipitously right at the same time, and we talked a little bit about it, and he wants to do an interview, so we're going to get an interview with him, and I do have a preview of what I've been working on for STOS if you want to see a little bit of it right now.
Yeah, let's see it. You going to share it?
Yeah, I'm going to share it. So let's do another screen share here. So I'll explain what's going on here, and I'm going to make a whole video about this, but what's going on here is I'm showing how to make an enemy formation in various ways. This is a tile sheet made as a Degas image, 3 aliens, each with 2 different frames of animation. And then this is me pulling each one of those out and dropping them into an array of strings. This is the actual formation that I've cached, and I show here.
So for anyone listening, if they're basically Space Invaders, like
yes, it's not. Well, it's basically the first level of Gorf, really. But saying that it's the first level of Gorf, not Space Invaders. The reason is there are 3 rows of 9 invaders. That's already 3 rows of 9 invaders. So that is. Was it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times 3? Is that 27? So that's way more than the number of STOS sprites that you have. So what this is an image that's moving across the screen in various ways. So right now I have a frame rate counter going when I do this on the screen, and this is too slow. This is running 8 frames a second. And what I need to get this up is to 20, 25 frames a second. So I'm working on various ways to get this running so that we can create enemy formations like this that move and animate, but are running at a good clip. So the next full tutorial is going to be what's the best way that I found to get this to work. I'm going to have to put these through the compiler to make them run faster, but eventually we'll get it to run at about 24 frames a second with other stuff going on. So it'll run pretty well.
Yeah, so Francois, he also worked on Amos, right? And
he worked on Amos, Click and Play, some other things. We'll find out all of it when I talk to him.
Yeah, Multimedia Fusion as well, which is sort of a Flash competitor at the time. They still have a product out there, the Click team, but I would love to understand, about STOS and stuff. So I look forward to your interview. So that we did a lot this time after waiting for a while. I think we also have some music from Tony Longworth, right?
So yeah, Steve, coming up right now after the end of this is a video, but song by Tony Longworth called Eyes Like the Sun.
Fantastic. All right, Jeff.
Okay, and until next time,
Into the vertical blank.
into the vertical blank.
Hi, this is Tony Longworth, UK dark alternative music composer and all-round Atari nut. Make sure to check out my Patreon music campaign. That's patreon.com/Tony Longworth. Lots of free music over there. And if you can afford $1 or $2, please help me continue to write music. Thanks so much for listening to this podcast and supporting Into the Vertical Blank. And I hope you like this piece of music of mine.
Into the vertical blank, our highest scores have been ranked.
an 8-Bit Rocket Studios production.